Imperva, a Thales company, is the cybersecurity leader that helps organizations protect critical applications, APIs, and data anywhere, at scale, and with the highest ROI. With an integrated approach combining edge, application security, and data security, Imperva protects companies through all stages of their digital journey. Imperva Threat Research and their global intelligence community enable Imperva to stay ahead of the threat landscape and seamlessly integrate the latest security, privacy, and compliance expertise into their solutions. Start a free trial today at securityweekly.com/Imperva. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Aaron Parecki about OAuth and the challenges in balancing user experience, developer experience, and security. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Akira Brand. Hello, Akira.
Hello, Mike. Played any good RPGs recently?
Oh, I love my RPGs. We're going to have an entirely different segment about that. But unfortunately, we have to talk about more exciting things. Let's see, you be the judge of application security. We swapped out John. He couldn't make it for the news segment, but we've got Akira as always. And Akira, this week on the news is unfortunately, I couldn't find any role-playing games, but we're going to have to add that as a mini segment. Who knows? But we do have a fun article from Anton Shuvakin called No Snow, No Flakes, which is a kind of a fun title that's riffing on Snowflake and a little bit of, call it the fog of war, or just the fog of not knowing all the details of a potential breach or a breach. Was it a breach? Was it not a breach? Which boiled down to what apparently seems to have happened is that Snowflake was not compromised. Network boundaries were not compromised, but many of its customers were targeted through credential stuffing, aka password guessing attacks, or password reuse if those credentials were stolen through. The users were reusing passwords that had been compromised in other venues. The point of this article, though, is not so much about Snowflake specifically or that idea of what really happened to the breach, who do we trust, etc. Details always emerge, but it's more about shared responsibility. And here, not so much the classic Amazon style of, configure your S3 buckets properly, or maybe Amazon should do better defaults on S3 buckets. This is really specifically about MFA. And here I'm curious, Akira, if you kind of off the top of your head, you don't need to name names, but if you think back to how many websites you use, or even whether your personal sites or through your work, how many of them would you say actually require MFA? Is it all of them?
Like a forced MFA or like an optional MFA?
Excellent question there, because that's an important distinction. So maybe we'll just start with MFA of any sort first. Then we'll tease that apart.
So MFA of any sort, I would say would be about 40%, which is pretty low, all things considered. And then, yeah, it's not a lot. Forced MFA, maybe like 15%, if that. Not great.
Wow. Not great. And you definitely predicted where I was going with this question, because there is also another website that we've mentioned a couple months ago, maybe a year ago, called sso.tax, which is what are SaaS applications that charge a premium for SSO support or MFA support. And the idea is that, as an industry, as a security industry, we want to push SaaS applications or all applications to not only support MFA, but as this article is starting to, poke out or think through, how much should we actually require that? And should the SaaS just require you must use MFA, and therefore it's their fault if there's a flaw in the MFA creation? We just talked with Aaron Parecki about authentication, authorization, all these things that go bad with cookie reuse, et cetera, that browsers are fixing or browsers are trying to address. Or do we always just blame the user, as it were, for not enabling it? And I think in this day and age, I fall very much less on my words aren't coming today, very much more on blaming the app owner, the SaaS provider, than blaming the user. Definitely have an allergy to blaming the user of these things.
Totally. I mean, there's a delicate balance you have to strike, right? Because if people use MFA by default, sometimes users are just like, no, I'm not interested. And you might lose customers. In fact, you might lose a lot of customers because people either don't understand what MFA is, or they just don't want to mess with it. and they'll go find a different app maybe that isn't as like doesn't have as many steps, right? Like that can really turn people off when they're first downloading your app, and it's like you have to use MFA, and you can lose people right there, right? I think the way to deal with it, in my personal opinion, is it actually has like 9 steps here in this article. There's number 6 where it just talks about how it's not set by default, but the UX nudges the user to consider using MFA. That's a great approach, I think, just so we can start to get people more used to like having to do it as a habit and seeing kind of maybe being annoyed into doing it as opposed to like having to force people to do it right off the gate. But I don't think we should just have it be completely optional because people just don't necessarily even know what it is yet. It's not
Yeah.
that new, but it's not like, I mean, we have all kinds of different people using the internet. It's not just a bunch of like computer people that use the web. Like there's all kinds of folks that just don't understand this stuff.
Yeah, and you hit that aspect of what if we annoy users or it's just too much friction for users to adopt it. And we've seen this even historically with some package maintainers on, I think it was NPM, that was requiring SSO for developers, and a handful of them said, you know what, this is just too much extra work for me. It's just enough for me to not care about maintaining this package anymore. And I like the idea of nudging users, encouraging them, but honestly, I think that's insufficient in this day and age. I think what we need are that UX design work of passkeys, something where it's just like, on an iPhone or on Android has an equivalent where you can just use your Face ID or a biometric, and the phone generates a certificate for you, and that certificate is used for authentication. I think the other thing that I wanted to pull out here is that I will admit that I can be annoyed by CAPTCHAs, and I think you would agree there that nobody likes having to fill those out. Just as much as I think we still see anti-patterns like password strength indicators. Those I think are honestly useless because if they're predicated on the password hash being compromised, being stolen, already many other bad things can happen. And we shouldn't be worried about password cracking a stolen password hash. If that, as I said, there are too many other avenues of attack once that has occurred. That for me is not in my threat model. What we should be worried about is password reuse or simple passwords that are very prone to guessing, which seemed to be what was happening here in Snowflake. But even if we had simple passwords, if we had that second factor, that multi-factor, however we want to call it, I think even what Google calls its two-step verification. So we don't even have a language around this about what do we mean when we say MFA, because I always jump to WebAuthn. So it's funny funny to me how a small article like this or just a small, do you require MFA can turn into, well, what do you mean by MFA? How annoyed do you want to make your users? How many customers do you want to lose? Which was that point you made. So
yeah, and it's interesting too. Like the last thing I want to mention, even in the lexicon of MFA, the average person does not understand what multi-factor authentication is. They don't know what authentication is. What the heck is that? I didn't know what authentication was until I started in this industry. I thought it was like had to do something with like your internal soul, like being who you really are. Like that's what I think of when I think of authentic, right? Which is kind of, I don't know. But like, this is a point of frustration for me personally, because I feel like so much of our good intentions are stymied by fancy words. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yes. And if I can expand on that, there's, there's a whole, we're going to talk about AI and LLMs in a second too, which brings in authenticity, which is similar in the root of this word, but still not quite authentication that we're focused on now. But as you were talking about, how do we explain this? How do we use big words or little words? One of my pet peeves in security awareness training is the idea of describing MFA as something you are and something you have. Yeah. Nobody cares about that. That's kind of meaningless because that just says, well, why do I care about something I am or something I are or something I have? Like I have my phone. Does this count? Like what are we talking about? When the language should be around something that is phishing resistant or, and again, I'm kind of going extemporizing here. It's not perfect language yet, but something that is that can't be replayed, something that can't be intercepted and reused. That's what we really care about these days about multi-factor authentication. And that's why I often probably repeat every single episode something about passkeys or WebAuthn, because it has these properties that it can't be replayed by an attacker, whereas cookies can be. And we just talked with Aaron about session cookies and how device-bound cookies or device-bound sessions are important to preventing these types of attacks, because nobody out there cares about who they are, what they have when we talk about authentication. They just care, did that stupid password strength indicator turn green, or is it still red because I need to add another piece of punctuation? That to me is just silly. That is the not helpful security. That to me is something where I wish OWASP would go and say, this is bad security, this is good security. Don't do like the OWASP top 10 of don't use that password strength indicator, use WebAuthn or use phishing replay resistant MFA or authentication mechanisms. And that is my soapbox. So thank you for your patience in listening to that again.
It was beautiful. Oh my God.
Speaking of other things that are potentially beautiful, I don't know, working on a segue there. I now have like 3 or 4 articles that are all about AI and offensive security. I don't know what was in the air the last couple of weeks, but it seems like everybody was talking about it. We have using AI for offensive security from the Cloud Security Alliance. We have challenges in red teaming AI systems from Anthropic. We have an article about nap time or evaluating offensive security of LLMs from Project Zero. And then one other thing about Apple's private cloud compute, as they're calling it with their Apple Intelligence, but we'll come to that last. So these articles about red teaming, one of the things that I thought was funny to point out is a question I'm going to ask you. You're going to help me demonstrate, I think, for our audience. What is red teaming in your mind? When you hear that, what's going on?
Yeah, sure. So I will say that I have not done a lot of red teaming, so my definition may be incomplete. But when I think of red teaming, I think of offensive security, right? So it's people that are actually trying to break into an application, or even a building, right? Like, for example, like
physical security. Okay.
Physical security, something like that, where like, say, let's relate it to an actual thing as opposed to a computer. So a blue team would be defense. It'd be like having a door that you lock, right? That's a blue team activity in terms of a house. A red team activity in terms of that sort of setting would be to try to pick the lock to get the door open, or brute force the lock by like hitting it with like a giant, we'll say grand, if you know, you know. It's to try to get the door open. And that's what red teaming is. But in, of course, the digital realm, it's more things like hacking into an application, trying to break in, trying to do pen testing is like a big popular red team activity. But other than those basic activities, I don't have a big breadth of what those activities are. So would love to learn more.
And that's fine, because there's a theme of these articles about using AI for offensive security, which I think you helped illustrate, going through metaphors and kind of saying pen testing, red teaming, and using a couple terms that even not everybody agrees with. And this is one of the themes of that Anthropic article, is that they're talking about, we want to red team, or we want to do security testing of AI systems, of LLMs, but they're saying nobody has quite the same language now for describing or defining what we mean. Does it mean a pen test where you are relatively scoped to a particular feature set, a particular application, and you're not trying to be surreptitious? You're not trying to not trigger alerts or trigger log analysis from the attack from the defenders? Or are you doing a red team in a, I'll say, more classic sense, where you have a goal-oriented, where you're trying to obtain access to a system or access to a cohort of data, and you are intended to not be detected by the blue team or any of the blue team systems? So there's these different levels of anti-surveillance, or avoiding detection, etc., that makes this conversation a little bit tough, which is also why we all often have to dive into metaphors. But pulling back a second, what they're really just saying, both on Anthropic and on the CSA article, is AI's here. Teams are going to start leveraging AI for their offensive testing, and how are they going to do it? in the CSA article, they're saying that, they're making some claims like LLMs are demonstrating emergent abilities like reasoning, and they can help with planning and these goal-oriented tasks that I mentioned, like red teams might be after. Rather than just say, tell me what the vulnerabilities are in this application, let me gain access to Mike's personal data, or let me gain administrator access to plant a back door so I can monitor traffic for the next several months. That's kind of a goal-oriented task. I'm pretty skeptical, honestly, of that statement that LLMs have reached this reasoning. But what their point is that a lot of it is, rather than being autonomous systems, they're more helping people. They're just, here's how to run this command line, here's how to use this framework. And again, I'm kind of shrugging like, okay, we should be talking about it, but there was nothing in there that was making me excited that LLMs are doing much different than helping you out with things that we already have, like a framework like different penetration testing tools, different scripting, etc. They might just be a little bit of helping to make you remember, oh, this is how I do this in Python. Here's a command line for curl that I didn't quite remember, or the man page for this shell script. So that's a lot of what I see as this type of help.
So here's my question for you, Mike. In the world of using AI for offensive security, what do you see as using AIs for defensive security?
So there's some similarities here too, and obviously the articles are focused on offensive, but the themes are how much can we rely on it? How much can we say it's doing data analysis? And I think that's a little bit what we'll likely see with the blue team side. And I'm glad you asked this question because I wanted to pull in the project Nap Time. This is this article on the offensive security capabilities from Project Zero, because they talk about this interplay between attacker and defender, in the sense that they're not interested in measuring how good LLMs are against a CTF style environment, or basically an environment that has a known vulnerability, that has a very constrained way of identifying and triggering and exploiting it. They're more open-ended in the sense that, well, here's some code. Does it have some vulns? It's not so contrived. And they're talking about how to use things like an LLM to drive Python. Give LLM access to a debugger or a fuzzing results to analyze the results of a fuzz test or a crash, or just something that the LLM has stochastically, to use a fun word, or to use the synonym of that, just randomly thrown together and attempted to test for this application to find a vuln or exploit a vuln. So giving LLMs access to these tools, enabling them with with Python, with debuggers, very similar to what a blue team could be doing with log analysis. Don't make me as a human read through a couple, not even just dozen, but a couple hundred, if not thousands of lines of log entries. Have the LLM pick out the anomalies, things that we've already been doing when we called it ML or just grep. Maybe LLMs are providing a bit more intelligence behind that, but that's roughly, I think in a nutshell, what these three articles are giving us. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea on at least where my mind was going when I was reading these things, Akira.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting too, like the correlation you just drew between red teaming and blue teaming, and like how it's a dance, right? It's kind of like two sides of the same coin. So it's pretty interesting.
Yes, and I think some other interesting things as we wrap up here and come to a quick close on a quick round of news this week. There was also, I mentioned Apple's private cloud compute. We're probably going to have to do a deep dive with you, me, and John on that sometime. A good segment talking about secure by design and the cryptographic primitives they're using to protect data. But I wanted to pull that in real quick as a compare and contrast with just the way that the user base, let's say, and the security community reacted to Microsoft's recall feature, which is that screenshots every 5 seconds that they'll then send up to Azure Cloud to do some analysis and OCR, and then back onto the device into a database that maybe isn't as protected as it could have been, versus Apple upfront describing and acknowledging a lot of these challenges already, acknowledging these concerns that if we're putting something into a cloud, it's very difficult to have technical enforcement mechanisms to say, well, yes, we have this restricted so that admins can't SSH and gain access to it. It's also very difficult, even if you say that in a blog post, to have transparency for that. And this is where they bring in the concepts of end-to-end encryption and who has access to keys, or what keys are this data being encrypted to. And we've seen this in things like already through iMessage, the end-to-end encrypted of that, end-to-end encryption transparency that we've seen in things like WhatsApp as well. So Meta is working on similar things on a different scale. And real quick, maybe just to squeeze in, what was really cool to me that I would love to hear more about is they've got an operating system that's like this amalgamation of Frankenstein of iOS and macOS. And to me, that's really cool because macOS is this user privileges based on user boundaries, meaning here's Mike's account, here's Akira's account. And the permission model is supposed to keep us as users separate. Whereas on iOS, it's more app-oriented boundaries. So this one app that you download shouldn't have access to the data of another app. And I think this combination gets really appealing when we talk about, or when Apple talks about how they're using this data and from a prompt, dropping it into a cloud for analysis off device, then bringing it back onto the device. So this is like a cool future that we want to see. And as I mentioned, probably something that needs a bit more than 60 seconds to talk about.
Totally.
So yes. So I know you have to run, Akira. I will wrap things up with us real quick. As I mentioned for our audience, we often talk about the Thinks Canary quarterly reviews. This is some really cool research research review that they put together as a PDF every quarter of things that they found interesting. And I included the link in the show notes, and I encourage all of our listeners to go check it out. A couple things that stood out to me were Print Listener. We had talked about this a couple months ago. This is about using the sound of your fingerprints across glass and figuring out what that the whorls and of your fingerprint look like from sound. It's just really cool side channel, and that always gets me excited. There's also another presentation here that was called Revisiting 2017, AI and Security 7 years later. And what's really interesting, and they point out, is that the presenter here was making a couple predictions about AI. And they said, 2018 probably will be the peak of artificial intelligence as it relates to InfoSec. A bit wrong off that. They didn't anticipate LLMs. But I think there's a lot of fundamental message there, the sense of, well, what are we using LLMs? What are we using AI for? Because very much they seem to be falling into the category of, here's a solution, but we need to go find some problems. And Project Zero, that article this week, is talking about how do they measure LLMs being used for offensive security. And at the moment, they're saying they're very basic vulnerability research. It's not quite something that they can definitely replace a humans on, or more even just rely on letting it run without a lot of really close human scrutiny. But there's a lot of human scrutiny that goes on to the research roundup of Q1 2024. So please read that. That was my segue of the week. I want to wrap up real quick by saying thank you to John, thank you to Akira, thank you to everyone who's been joining us. Please remember to subscribe, share on the socials, check out the show notes, and speaking of humans and all the things that humans can do, check out Diskette Disco by Sphero. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.